So good evening. My name's John Wilkinson. I'm Director of the Programme in Creative Writing and a Professor in the Department of English. And I'm delighted to introduce my brilliant colleague Jen Scappettone this evening. She's asked me to refrain from the characteristic University of Chicago introduction. Perhaps everyone has now forgotten those days when personal appearances encouraged and introduced us the flashy, the catty, the subtly or not so subtly self-promoting, without fear that these advertisements would be preserved in the digital domain. But I'm grateful to Jen for her restraining permission, because a tour d'horizon of her art and scholarship would soon remind us that a horizon is infinite, with its line and illusion created only by our short-sightedness. Now, scappato in Italian is an adjective meaning runaway or in flight, and derives from a verb meaning to give the slip. How apt for Jen's protean practice, at once strictly materialist and alchemical. I'll borrow from her own account of her poetical work in progress. It charts the ecological and geopolitical impacts of copper extraction in the advancement of transnational telecommunications technologies, the contemporary version of alchemical transformation, with the base metal and how base its origins, transmuted into streams of lies disguising its originatory matrix. Researching the Superfund-listed toxic waste dump and adjacent copper mill across the street from her family home for her shape-shifting book, The Republic of Exit 43, initially spurred by a desire to find a culprit for her mother's cancer, led to a chain of discoveries surrounding the impacts of transnational copper extraction and dovetailed with the desire to ground the seemingly immaterial sphere of data travel and storage in a reality of labour struggle, boom-boost cycles, and environmental devastation. The resulting textual diptych, a book of essays titled A Copper Liar, focused on unwitting monuments to copper exploitation, such as the Guggenheim Museum and the Statue of Liberty, and a cross-genre work titled Smoke Penny, Lyrecord, Heaven Bread, presents the cotton circuitry within contemporary homes, devices, and servers as an immense lyre stretching from the Andes to the African copper belt and US West, the shuddering foundation of the global network, as she writes. A lyre perhaps, but also, as in a car's wiring, at once a loom and a harness. Now that survey of extraction, of elaborated networks, of coding, of radical translation between media, also becomes, in Jen's transmedial work, a performance of what it investigates, describes, and makes lyric. A radical poesis, a setting forth with the intention of making imaginable, in the face of damage, both global and individual, a habitable place. What I've described with the help of Jen's words may already sound like an infinite horizon, and her talk today, Poetry After Barbarism, Fascism, the abracadabrant word, and the invention of a motherless tongue, might seem to belong to a separate project. But I understand that difference only in the sense that a Gall-Peters projection differs from a Mercator projection, while both project the same world. This talk, we might anticipate, to extend the thinking of Jen's groundbreaking translations of the polylingual poet Emilia Rosselli, Locomotrix, and her important introductory essay to that volume, and to extend it at a time of emergency. Mythologizing of the mother tongue resonates with the motherland and right-wing nationalism, with a politics that demands immigrants submit to an adaptive mother, the mother demanding all should watch their tongues. In the 20th century and in the wake of fascism, a condition of deep ambivalence in relation to mother tongue is famously exemplified in the poetry of Paul Celan. But the mother tongue of the majority of people in the Anglosphere carries with it a history of exploitation, having passed and passing still along the trade routes of extraction, returning from refineries as the normative language of business and instruction, an English which has been called globish, bleached clean of its origins. How does a poet go about making a home in such a linguistic environment? In the face of globish, how does a poet resist asserting authenticity through a mother tongue? It's impossible to think of this lecture's topic without recognizing that there is no after to barbarism, and that what seemed unimaginable to one of my generation, fascism resurgent in Europe, is celebrated and emulated here and now with the real possibility that naked white supremacism and patriarchal imposition over women's lives might triumph. What the great American poet of democracy, Frank O'Hara, celebrated as a horizon line that's beautifully keen, precarious, and doesn't sag beneath our variable weight, is something we must still raise our sights towards and beyond. And in her work, Jen Scappettone extraordinarily has the vision to help us to see past our short-sightedness and imagine how, poetically, we might yet dwell on and with the earth. Jen.
That was just a phenomenal, John. I really feel like I can just stop now. I need to think about it. That was so rich and just so typically generous. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out in the rain and in the midst of what turns out to be a sudden barrage of postponed events. I want to acknowledge, first of all, the many languages that have suffused and still suffuse this land we congregate on. Languages of the Three Fires Confederacy, and this place's status, past and current, as a site of trade and healing for more than a dozen other Native tribes. I also want to acknowledge that this is the place where the English department traditionally held its faculty meetings, and that I feel the absence of Lauren Berlant, whose support I appreciate dearly to this day. I wish I could have shared this material with them. And finally, I want to acknowledge Michael Fisher and especially Starsha Gill's hard work on making this happen live after a delay of 2 years after innumerable changes of direction. Starsha, wherever you are our captain. The concerns of this manuscript have orbited around me for a dozen years, since the publication of my translation of the selected works of the refugee from fascist Italy, Amelia Rosselli, a volume intended for a more or less general audience, and for which certain aspects of responsible translation or theorization were thus left in abeyance. My interests in this issue go back farther than that. I called my first doctoral seminar here Realism and the Abracadabrant Word, adopting a term from Henry James to describe the amalgamative languages of immigrant experimental arts communities on the Lower East Side. And it's certainly the case that my interest in this kind of work came from the feast of translingual poetry across media being composed by my interlocutors within an experimental literary world perceived as Anglophone, from Edwin Torres to Antena Aire, Don Michoy, and Latasha N. Nevada Diggs. The research from which these ruminations hail emerged from a desire to delineate the aesthetic and political legacies and lapses of modernist discourse cast as duality between internationalist cosmopolitanism on the one hand and nationalism on the other. A project begun along different lines in the Rosselli translations and in my book on modernism in Venice, a locus the poet Andrea Zanzotto characterized as one of cosmic extraterritoriality. It also aimed to understand how radical aesthetics could be drawn to or co-opted by either direction on the political continuum. This is particularly the case within fascist Italy, where rather than establishing exhibitions of degenerate art, the regime drew much of its seeming élan from the avant-garde, the cult of futurity, youth, and masculine violence propagated through crafty use of mass media. This book manuscript extends aspects of the labor of translation on a narrative, historiographical, and theoretical front. It hones in on poets subject to a range of dislocations who draw on that experience to produce uniquely translingual artifacts with no pellucid address, dreaming of a collective, yet hailing no pre-established public. These poems have a rambunctious relationship to national languages, and those composed in the wake of fascism's initial rise and fall harbor terror or disgust toward the authoritarian project of forging a top-down tale of the tribe, to echo Ezra Pound. The ever unfinished task of translating Amelia Rosselli and her ambit led me to significant peevishness surrounding the world literature debates and their generic tendencies, with the way narrative still dominates these conversations, as if poetic discourse acts centripetally to unify and centralize the verbal ideological world, as Mikhail Bakhtin charged in the Dialogic Imagination. This artifact, by the poet, translator, artist, and radical philologist Emilio Villa, a contemporary of Rosselli, refutes such cliches in its centrifugativity, announcing itself as a mute record that invites readers to set it spinning, either literally or virtually, turning reading of the strange or foreign into a vertiginous act of separation and recombination across three languages. Prevailing notions of poetry that cast it as more locally and nationally rooted than prose artificially extinguish from the record a critical mass of poets who reckon with what Bakhtin called the Tower of Babel mixing of languages, engulfing any object of representation, in spite of the fact that, as Villa pointed out in the Sao Paulo-based journal Habitat in 1952, the most elevated exemplars of human poetry developed, or better, deflagrated precisely at the apex of the most confused linguistic mixtures in the critical punctums of cosmopolitanism, with Homer writing in 4 strata of dialect, and in great part overflows of barbarous, that is to say, not Greek, vocabularies, and Dante mixing Tuscan vernacular with entire tercets in Provençal, French, Latin, Hebrew. Villa's word deflagrated signals his inheritance of the furious kineticism of the futurists, which he conducts through study of Mediterranean and Eastern antiquity and geopolitically anarchic verse. This book project argues that poets act as forceful agents of linguistic and consequently of cultural change, and that certain poets poised at the experiential or studied boundary of language systems make the translational elements of all language particularly emphatic, and here I am echoing Wael Hassan's term translational. These poets place on display languages bursting at its imagined seams in accounts of experience migrating across policed ethnic and national divisions, such that their work comes across as dissonant, dissident, made for no given group, or no yet extant one. This disfluency in their use of multiple language systems has an effect contrary to that of the boastfully masterful pastiches of multilingual modernist monuments, and it is wobblier than any fluid act of code switching. Indeed, the eccentric qualities of these texts cause them to seem impossibly bizarre, opaque, such that despite their uses of natural languages, a critical tick for their analysis becomes not translation, but their classification as non-semantic, leading to the frequent invocation of glossolalia, a biblical term for non-lexical utterances, commonly known as speaking in tongues. I've instead set out to elaborate the dream of xenoglossia, the unstudied or inspired, even divine or otherwise paranormal channeling of natural languages by subjects deemed improper to those languages, whether by education or by blood. Xenoglossia, a phenomenon narrated in the story of Pentecost, expresses a desire to resolve the cultural, ethnic, and even racial divisions instituted by divine punishment at Babel, yet the term is actually coined in the early 20th century. In 1904, Henry James returned to New York after 2 decades of expatriation in Europe. documenting his astonishment at the cheerful hum of that babel of tongues present in Central Park, generated by successive waves of immigration. While registering considerable disquietude in the face of this metamorphic soundscape, James apprehended that such convocation of perceived outsiders was to forge an idiom fantastic and abracadabrant, belonging to no known language. James's vision manifested both the utopian promise of the ethnic synthesis on display in the transcultural metropolis, which would materialize in the tumultuous century to come through forms as different as skyscrapers of Babel and the global village, and an anxiety surrounding the integrity of national languages, legible in political motions as immediate as the 1907 Dillingham Commission and recent as the 2017 RAISE Act, both aimed at curtailing U.S. immigration by privileging applicants literate in English. Though James held back from projecting this abracadabrant language into his prose, modernist artists across the globe who embraced the linguistic welter being generated by mass migration would soon consummate his predictions through poetic experimentation. The year James's reflections were published, both references to the myth of Babel and compensatory dreams of a common language were profuse. In 1905, the First World Congress of Esperanto was convened on the edge of the English Channel, and the word xenoglossia coined to denote the intelligible use of natural languages never learned, granting a scientific name to that phenomenon described in the story of Pentecost, envisioning Babel's miraculous resolution. While Doctoro Esperanto was presenting the case for an artificial universal language to an audience of linguists, diplomats, and logicians, a multi-ethnic, multiracial group of Pentecostals led by the African-American preacher William J. Seymour in Los Angeles was claiming, among other gifts of the Holy Ghost, the sudden ability to speak in foreign languages without instruction. In testifying to channeling a multitude of languages, these seminal gatherings of what is now known as the Azusa Street Revival came under suspicion for promoting disgraceful intermingling of the races. While Esperantists strove to overcome linguistic difference, revivalists were perceived as a threat because in acts of tongues and xenoglossia, they occupied zones of linguistic and thus cultural difference. Often confused with glossolalia or lexically incommunicative utterances, xenoglossia has received scarce elaboration as a secular concept, despite its unmistakable socio-political implications. It represents the incorporation of natural languages by those perceived to be lacking the proper education or birthright, lacking what Giunta Lahiri, writing in Italian, calls una vera padronanza, or authentic mastery. In the 20th century, a century of unprecedented scales of global communication and conflict, the desire for a vehicle of expression that would traverse cultural borders necessarily inflected poetry, the art most self-consciously focused on the word, as did the fervor surrounding technologies that seemed to make it possible, from the cabled telegraph to the wireless. However, the ethnic syntheses provisionally generated through xenoglossic verse fail by design to fall into line with prevailing dictates of citizenship through democratic assimilation or fascist colonization within and beyond the nation-state. They also resist compliance with the economizing drives of communication under globalization through international languages, such as English. An even more discomfiting rebuke to received ideologies of language, people, and state resides in their failure to comply with received notions of minority vernaculars, with understandings, that is, of coming from or belonging to any localizable home. Unlike Russian futurist transcends, Dada, and other non-lexical sound poetry, xenoglossic poetry occupies an uncomfortable space within the perceivable precincts of, yet skidding across or confusing, national and other localizable languages. It's been a long time since Dante made the claim that the vernacular was the tongue learned without any formal instruction by imitating our nurses, and Dante's nurse would not have been coincident with mother. Yet, as Yasmin Yildiz has demonstrated, we still fall back on a phantasm of biological essentialism when discussing language nativity, despite the undermining of reigning concepts of monolingualism by geopolitical realities and brutalities. Beyond the prevailing discursive dyad of elite culture sampling and code switching between authentic and imposed tongues hovers a corpus of polyglot texts forged by speakers for whom the concept of a mother tongue has been occluded. Poems composed in orphan tongues, and that's Don Mi Choi's phrase, manifest their disbelonging to reigning nation states or fixed communities, while aspiring to craft room for utopian congregations of linguistic and cultural alterity. Before turning to those orphan tongues, however, this book project needed to face off against a modernist whose early embrace of the newly international address opened up by radio and whose multinational aesthetic campaigns from London to St. Petersburg and Sao Paulo seemed to point toward the dissolution of those borders, yet who ended up serving their reinforcement precisely through expansionism, the futurist F.T. Marinetti. And here I have to apologize and issue a trigger warning that some of the following material is really offensive, though I won't cite the worst of it. I've had a hard time writing about it, forcing myself to do so for this occasion, for I feel one can't understand what xenoglossip before fleshing out which transcultural formations are simply appropriationist or colonialist or actually fascist. Notwithstanding Marinetti's cosmopolitan upbringing and multilingual output and the transcultural origins of others in his ambit, Italian futurists declared from their first 1910 serata, staged in the then Austro-Hungarian city of Trieste, that all freedom and all progress occurs within the circle of the nation. The futurists, prior to fascism's invention by a combination of artistry and street violence, were acting in the grip of irredentism, or the notion that territories unintegrated by Italy during the formal creation of the modern nation state in 1860 should be redeemed as Italian, whether by diplomacy or force. The bulk of these artists, with notable exceptions in Francesco Cangiulo and Aldo Palazzeschi, soon espoused fascism. The historical avant-garde makes it a primary mission to transform the language. Yet within the just unified and largely undeveloped state of Italy, which Marinetti's early biographer characterized as a classical fatherland of illiteracy, the national language still begged to be transformed into an integral phenomenon, as the ubiquitously invoked post-Risorgimento dictum, "Italy has been made, now it is time to make Italians," elicits. Marinetti, the erstwhile enemy of academies and libraries, ultimately directed his transnational enterprise toward reactionary linguistic ends. Summoned by Mussolini to the newly established Italian Academy in 1929, he would advance the dictator's call to defend the Italian language by inventing new Italian words in order to expel foreign contaminants. The cosmopolitan, whose career was launched in French, became a cog in the machinery of the doomed project of the autarky of language, as if any national language could be fortressed against infiltration by other tongues, foreign or local. In his preface to the volume Autarky of Language, Marinetti characterizes the expulsion of foreign words and importations as part of the holy campaign directed at the absolute integrity of the Italian language, part of combat against every form of xenophilia. The fascist regime built in an ideologically pointed, doctrinaire, and systematic way on early 20th century efforts to nationalize the language of a state that was only a few decades old, unified out of a fragmented set of city-states, kingdoms, duchies, and colonies of other states, and was inherently multilingual. and to intervene in the linguistic experience of a citizenry for whom the use of local dialect predominated. The imposition of a national norm was introduced through proliferating channels, education, grammars, dictionaries, encyclopedias, propaganda, and mass media campaigns spanning radio, film, architectural inscription, photography and the press, the Italianization of toponyms, and the syncretic, motto-oriented Roman oratory of Mussolini, crafted for the ears of thronging militarized or paramilitarized assemblies. Pedagogical reforms initially introduced by the philosopher Giovanni Gentile, identified by Mussolini as the most fascist of all the reforms, increased participation in schooling, combating illiteracy, and aiming to move from dialect to language through the teaching of Italian, while including Latin as an echo of ancient imperial grandeur. The creation of the Accademia d'Italia was a linchpin in the regime's efforts to marshal culture toward homogenization, and was tasked with production of a new dictionary to fight off the centrifugal influence of dialects, minor languages, and importations. This is the context in which Marinetti continued the efforts of his most pronounced aesthetic and political demagogue predecessor, Gabriele D'Annunzio, in promoting the Italianization of the language. In order better to understand the way the deterritorialized cosmopolitanism which characterized the Alexandria of Marinetti's youth could have led him ultimately to a promotion of autarky, I will turn to a specific case, his collaboration on a work of Words and Freedom, directly serving that project in the period of European sanctions against fascist aggression. While Marinetti's national identification and its supranational extensions remain unmistakable, it is misleading to characterize him as straightforwardly Italian or even cosmopolitan, as though all international capitals were on the same footing in the period of his aesthetic and political campaigns. His writings position him straightforwardly between the cultural capital of Paris and two more peripheral metropolises, Milan and Alexandria. Writing as director of what was soon to become an interventionist journal, Il Marzocco, its title taken from D'Annunzio, illustrious poetaster and theorist of the Italian race, or stirpe, stock, against the barbari, or barbarians, soon to be founder of the Italian Nationalist Association, Enrico Corradini, characterized Marinetti as twice deracinated, insofar as he is Italian and writes in French, insofar as he writes in French and lives in Milan. And so this young man has two half-fatherlands and no whole one. He is in flesh and bones and in books of prose and poetry a revolution against all our conceptions and preconceptions regarding the bonds between one's birth country and country of residence. This characterization, however discerning of the contradictions sustaining Marinetti as European cosmopolitan, leaves out the poet's settler Africanity, a crucial aspect of his cultivated persona from his earliest writings. Marinetti's father, a lawyer from Piedmont specializing in commercial contracts, moved to Alexandria in 1865, setting up additional offices in Cairo and Khartoum, Sudan, to represent foreign companies and individuals involved in the aggressive modernization plan launched by Ismail Pasha, an ambitious figure granted the semi-sovereign Ottoman title of viceroy, educated in Paris, who was intent on maximizing Egypt's position between Europe and Africa and on Egypt's expansion along the Nile. Ismail the Magnificent's costly projects were aimed at reducing the country's dependence on Britain and France, yet it ended up incurring so much debt that he lost control over Egyptian finances to European bankers, provoking nationalist uprising against government collaborators and British military occupation, as well as Marinetti Sr.'s retreat to Milan in the early 1880s. These Egyptian development projects ranged from the construction of the Suez Canal to telegraph and transport infrastructure to education and governmental reform. Though critically neglected, the parallels between Marinetti's Alexandria and his Milan, economic centers of developing Mediterranean territories, are numerous. Touchstones of the Italo-Turkish War launched notoriously from the air upon Libya in 1911. That was the first bombardment from airplane, were aimed at exploiting the weakness of the Ottoman Empire, granting Italy potential dominance over the southern Mediterranean and the approach to the Suez Canal, and to Italy's already extant colonies in Somalia and Eritrea. These were the events that excited the young poet impresario into his most beguiling aesthetic innovations, elaborated through a series of manifestos and summarized in the 1913 Destruction of Syntax, Wireless Imagination, Words in Freedom. Marinetti capitalizes upon images of his childhood in Egypt, concoctions of exoticism and nostalgia to justify imperial violence throughout his career. His notorious birth as a futurist, narrated in the prologue to the founding of and manifesto of Futurism of 1909, landed famously on the front page of Le Figaro, thanks to an Egyptian business friend of his late father and shareholder of the newspaper. The birth scene takes place following a minor car accident on the industrial periphery of Milan in his Fiat convertible, where he ends up in a maternal trench teeming with factory sludge. I stopped short and, to my disgust, rolled over into a ditch with my wheels in the air. Oh, maternal ditch brimming with muddy water, fair factory drain. I gulped down your bracing slime, which reminded me of the sacred black breast of my Sudanese nurse. When I climbed out a filthy, stinking rag from underneath the capsized car, I felt my heart being slashed deliciously with the red-hot iron of joy. What's stunning about this passage is how boldly this futurist depicts the European, and specifically Italian, need to nurse itself on the colonial exploitation of Africa in order to propel its culture into the future. While the stress on the nurse's black skin racializes the scene, underscoring that this maternal caregiver was black and not Arab. In this notorious avant-garde origin story, Africa supplies the natural and human resources that make the future possible. Elsewhere, he describes the arms and breasts of his Sudanese nurse in relation to coal as coke or pet coke colored. These resources are simultaneously confused with the detritus of industrial processes. The milk or petroleum of origins and the stain of industrial waste are imbibed simultaneously in the factory channel to fuel the phallic surge of the newborn futurist, who does not emerge immaculate, but cast as a filthy rag, irradiated with the imprisoned radiance of electric hearts. Prior to this red-hot release from the maternal ditch, Marinetti condenses and foretells a history of exploitation, forming the basis of his fatherland's technological rise in a single self-mythologizing image of nursing, from the Italian colony in Libya to be established several years later, and a repercussive century of oil, gas, labor, soldier, and refugee flows, to fascist imperial war in East Africa. In observing that the so-called unification of Italy was actually a colonization of the rural Italian South by the developing North, Sardinian Marxist Antonio Gramsci made use of the figure of the leech that enriched itself at the expense of the South. Its economic industrial growth was directly correlated with the impoverishment of the Southern economy and agriculture. He could as well have deployed the figure of this suckling infant, fattening itself at the expense of territories in the global South brutally seized, for Marinetti's text allows us to perceive the mother's milk as another form of resource extraction. Between the so-called heroic phase of futurist manifestos preceding the Great War and the fascistization of language, the political system of Italy was aggressively overhauled, though an essential fervor for supranationalist expansionism remained intact. through the revanchist rhetoric of the mutilated victory of World War I, D'Annunzio's populist seizure of the Croatian port of Fiume in 1919, the histrionics of the 1922 March on Rome, which secured the fascist regime in myth and in practice, and the 1935 Italian invasion of Ethiopia. It is this last episode on which I'll now focus, one often interpreted as paving the way for the Second World War, consolidating support for fascism in Italy, and signaling the danger of fascism's spread from Geneva to Harlem. The strategic importance of Ethiopia within Mussolini's imperial program would have echoed the reasons for aerial attack on Ottoman Tripoli that jump-started Marinetti's experimentation with wireless telegraphic verse. Marinetti actually volunteered to serve on the Ethiopian front at 60 years of age. The fascist invasion of Ethiopia can be seen as an apotheosis of the nationalist consolidation of Italy achieved by the Libyan War that effectively launched Marinetti's most radical aesthetic innovations. This cruel campaign, launched in 1911, remained unremitting despite declarations of peace, due to formidable Berber and Arab resistance until 1932, when Italy occupied the entire country. Lucia Re interprets the Libyan War as a turning point and an important racially oriented shift in the process of making Italians. Re also presents this racialized campaign and its constitutive atrocities as the clearest evidence of the embarrassing long-term continuity between liberal and fascist Italy. I would add that this continuity has been repressed not only by Italians, but by international theorists of the avant-garde eager to recuperate the so-called heroic or avant-garde production of futurism during its anarchist phase in a semi-palatable light as product of desire to break down existing economic and political structures and to transcend nationalist barriers, to quote Marjorie Perloff. Opposition to the Libyan War by leftists and revolutionary socialists on the grounds that class rather than race formed the proper grounds for conflict led to the left's ultimate loss of popularity and power in a country just 50 years old, deeply divided between a civilized North and a peasant South, theorized as feminized, atavistic, barbarian, and racialized as African or Arab. Re outlines the elaborate process, I guess I don't have that here, by which war in North Africa unified Italians along the lines of race. The Libyan War press campaign and the war itself in its literary construction created like never before in the face of glaring physical, behavioral, linguistic, religious, and cultural differences among Italians of different sexes, geographical areas, and social classes. The belief, however precarious and illusory, in an ethnic racial sameness. A similar process of racialized identification and differentiation through opposition to an inferior other, promoted through new instruments of mass persuasion, later allowed Italians, including Italian Jews, to feel again once truly one, and fascism to reach its peak moment of national consensus during the conquest of Ethiopia in 1935 to 36. Ethiopia's conquest would have signified for Italians an important belated act of redemption against the Kingdom of Italy's ignominious 1896 defeat at Adwa in its First African War, which definitively checked its colonial ambitions in the Horn of Africa. That war's opposition by socialists and the working class had also embarrassed Italy by bearing the fledgling country's internal rifts. Ethiopia became a unique rallying point for Black internationalism and for other anti-colonial and anti-fascist movements across races, ethnicities, and continents. A League of Nations member regarded as Africa's last Black empire, one never subject to colonization, Ethiopia became a preeminent symbol of Pan-Africanism, or simply Ethiopianism, an earlier theologically inflected millenarianism of divine retribution for the suffering of African peoples. These movements were bolstered upon the 1896 defeat of the Italian invaders. Ethiopia's invasion by Mussolini's forces signified a threat to black dignity and freedom the world over. It was resisted through grassroots efforts at military assistance from Kingston to Chicago, and through support groups, protests, and labor stoppages from West African villages to Johannesburg, Rio de Janeiro, Trinidad, Oklahoma, Miami, Chicago, Marseille, and London, to name just a few. As Ruth Ben-Ghiat has narrated, in August 1935, in a period when Hearst newspapers hosted Mussolini's column and Time magazine featured the dictator with a cover profile, while New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia contributed to the fascist invasion with a $100,000 check. 25,000 New Yorkers made up of Pan-Africanists and leftists of various ethnicities and races marched down Harlem's Lenox Avenue in a protest. A rally of 10,000 at Madison Square Garden followed in the weeks to come, featuring speeches by W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, and the burning of an effigy of Il Duce. Emperor and spiritual leader Haile Selassie, also known as Rastafari, around whom the Rastafarian religion was created, exiled in England, addressed the League of Nations to testify to Italian atrocities in 1936, calling out their barbarous tactics of poison gas. Between the invasion and the 1941 Italian retreat in the face of Allied forces, 400,000 troops were deployed in an immense drain on resources, funded in part by the gold wedding rings donated by Italian and Italian immigrant women. 250,000 Ethiopians were killed, including civilians, via massacre, aerial bombardment, concentration camps, and mustard gas in violation of the Geneva Conventions. Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 led the League of Nations to impose economic sanctions upon the fascist regime. These were largely unenforced and ineffectual, while the seizure of Addis Ababa in May of 1936 led Mussolini to declare that he had founded the empire, as you see in this slide of a mural cast in concrete in the popular neighborhood of Trastevere, which I was shocked to learn was restored in 2017 and is on display. When I last lived there, it remained behind a velvet curtain. To give you a sense of the disturbing pertinence of this episode to what we're living today, the UK Guardian reported yesterday that if the UN fails over Putin and Ukraine, as the League of Nations did over Mussolini and Ethiopia, then the global consequences, as in the 1930s, may be catastrophic for all. Nonetheless, the economic sanctions prompted the ramping up of a large-scale movement toward Italian autarky, or economic self-sufficiency, announced by Mussolini in August 1935. This is the campaign that led Marinetti to declare in Autarky of Language that the first autarkic problem is the Italianity of the language. I will close this penultimate section of my talk with a troubling of both autarky and the concept of the mother and the mother tongue through analysis of the 1937 artist's book, Poema del vestito di latte, Poem of the Milk Dress, a collaboration between Marinetti, Accademico d'Italia, and the young Milanese designer Bruno Munari, an apolitical figure who had befriended the futurists early on. Munari is best known for his groundbreaking and far more palatable post-war design. Recalling the primal scene of Futurism's founding at the remembered breast of Marinetti's Sudanese nurse, this free-word poem juxtaposing the Ethiopian invasion with autarkic, milk-based manufacturing was commissioned by the propaganda office of Italy's largest producer of synthetic textiles. It exposes a fascinating yet no less barbaric complication of any purist ideology of autarky or the mother tongue, which Dante said, we learn without any formal instruction by imitating our nurses. Celebrating empire through the fascist state's autarkic production of milk fiber as implicitly dependent upon the choking of the Horn of Africa. The textile industry in Italy, in which women constituted the workforce majority, was still a cornerstone of the Italian economy, even as the steel industry was developed. But wool and cotton depended on imports, and silk was a luxury market. Even viscose rayon production required high-quality cellulose from Scandinavian wood and fossil fuels that Italy did not possess. Marinetti and Munari's elaborately produced work of propaganda celebrates the invention of lanital, the first commercially manufactured regenerated protein fiber patented in 1935 by an Italian chemist. Casein, a protein contained in mammalian milks and thus native to Italy, could be processed and pressed through spinnerets to form silk-like viscose fibers. Through a brief reading of this poem and related futurist works, Jeffrey Schnapp brings out that as a key component of industrialization, fabrics had assumed a central, symbolically charged place in the universe of commodities, acting as a key indicator of a modern nation-state's ability to project its power at home and abroad. Under the regime, fabric becomes the technologically enhanced double of a primary skin, seen as once enfeebled and enervated, but reinvigorated thanks to the fascistization of the Italian body politic. What interests me here are the gendered, racialized, and colonial dynamics that drop out of this analysis, published some time back in Critical Inquiry, from whom I draw this image. Through alluring montages of imagery and verses' unpunctuated streams heralding the manufacture of this fabric, this collaboration exhumes the lawless imperial conquest that is as constitutive of Italy's apparent autarky as the Sudanese nurse was to futurism's birth. Brute juxtaposition bears the enmeshment of overdetermined oppositions, of liquidity and armed territory reinforced by steel, the colonizing body and the maternal fluid vital to its reinforcement, of black and white. The text can be read as a fascist version of Dziga Vertov's communist Kino Eye reverse time sequence, tracing the origins of beef and undoing commodity fetishism in the process, revealing the repressed substrate of an autarkic body of state. The book strips bare the nuptials between Europe and its colonized others, the ethno-racial fantasy and fear of cross-contaminated blood, milk, oil, and gas. The biblically resonant poem narrates the journey of an embedded reporter, fighter, futurist poet from combat in Tembien to Khartoum, down the Suez Canal and onto a projectile train to Rome, where a celebration of the Mussolinian Empire is described in a delirium of histrionically white, milkish imagery. The text then transitions into the manufacturing of lanital, as casein is siphoned off from milk, and maternal machines produce a polyphony of colorful thread, a milk that beatifically returns to its pure breast, bobbin, bobbin, mine, mine, mine. The text concludes on the declaration of milk of armed iron, milk at war, militarized milk, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of this image. The book is remarkable for its design innovations, from the photo collaged elements to the etched graphics printed in monochrome Italian red and green and grayscale, to the self-referential inclusion of cellophane that creates overlays of aerial and liquid imagery, a rain of bullets in one case, the moths that won't corrode this rayon in another. The startlingly modern design has led many to a habit Claudia Rankine called out last evening, to stop at the pictorial, calling attention to the work's evidence of, for instance, futurist ability in the art of advertising and propaganda, while simultaneously proposing an unusual marriage of art, fashion, and technology. I resist the temptation not to read the imagery or the poetry, though my revulsion is potent. Through montage, floating signifiers of the natural world are wedded to the machinery of war and textiles as the work moves from combat in Ethiopia to the autarkic Italian factory. Bodily organs suspended in space, the lungs on the first page spread, the stomach in the second, are juxtaposed with clouds and clouds of dust in armed combat, presumably of gunfire, possibly of mustard gas. The third page spread features armed tanks and a formation of attack planes before the work moves on to juxtapose images of cows being milked and pastoral sheep with kitchen or laboratory jars and the spinnerets that will make fabric of their maternity. The final spread juxtaposes a cannon and a mass of lanitol fiber. The poem begins in battle in the Ethiopian province of Tembien, an offensive known for its large-scale deployment of mustard gas, with a speaker thirsty and choking on putrid and stinking dust clouds who is given milk just milked in an iron cup. In Tembien, I was burning with thirst. A friend miraculously gifted me a can of snow-white condensed paradise. Throughout, the whiteness of milk and its signification as a maternal nurturing fluid will be exploited to palliate and racialize the scene of conquest as the narrative embarks upon return to Rome along a corporeal African landscape. The holy dawn milk that soothes the smoking lungs and satiates the throat of living and dying Italian volunteers will be contrasted with the thick broth of the Red Sea cooked by Sudanese women cast as witches, and the throats of the relieved Italians contrasted with the throat or choke point of the Suez Canal lacking candor. The speaker situates himself at the meeting point of three continents, at the confluence of the White and the Blue Nile, in Khartoum, where Marinetti's father had had an office, and political unrest led to an Anglo-Egyptian Sudan government. The return to Rome in this text seems to refer to celebrations of the 2000th anniversary of Augustus Caesar's birth, part of the Augustean exhibition of Romanity. In a hallucinatory scene, the reborn empire of Mussolini is feted with an aerial squadron compared to a pack of scissors and scrap metal hunks, whose blabbermouth shadows acrobatically lick the milky altar of the fatherland. At the same time, the Italianized African sun opens its rosy oven mouth, emitting sparrows in search of water, while bronze dubats, or the colonial troops of Italian Somaliland, spring out of cream skins and give up flights of swallows wriggling out of the indigenous night towards the ideal European milk. While peppered with African place names and terms, the poem manifests this drive to invert the scene in the founding of futurism, to domesticate the dubat, to make Africans drink European milk rather than the other way around. And here I think of Nestle, but that's another story. At the same time, the fluidity and femininity associated with women, communism, and the other that Klaus Televeit theorized 50 years back as central to the fascist imagination, an association we see in early modernism across the continents, must be drawn off in order for milk to be militarized and adapted for national textile use. One of the speaker's final declarations will be, "I am the hard man, not adequately milky, while nursed with the best snow-white milk of the beyond, making milk transubstantial." The text imagines the Colosseum as an immeasurable sieve that skims cirruses of cream to celebrate the Mussolinian Empire before the man, clearly Mussolini, commands, "Milk, divide yourself." Schnapp points out that this modernist reworking of the separation of land from water in Genesis to narrate the separation of cheese from whey and casein from water also echoes Aristotle, due to whose writings cheese-making becomes a Western analogy for how semen succeeds in fixing the menstrual fluid secreted in the universe. I would add that given the geopolitical context of this text, we must see in the division of solid from liquid the parting of the Red Sea, which leads to the crossing of Israelites and drowning of Egyptians. However genocidal, this text haunts, because Marinetti never successfully expels a desire to be both Arab and European, black and white, from colonial conquest. The dependence upon Africa so histrionically dramatized in this work topples the autarkic precepts that commissioned it. leading us to run through a centrifuge and thereby denaturalize not only mother's milk and textile, but consolidated tongue and text. So I had to end on a different note from that. So this is a short coda because I could not end with that. Born into a working-class family outside of Milan in 1914, Emilio Villa studied ancient languages at seminary school in Lombardy from 1925 to 32. As a secular guest at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome, he developed an interest in pre-biblical Semitic languages when the rise of fascism and eventual 1938 adoption of anti-Semitic race laws cast a shadow over Semitic study in Italy. He was further trained in Assyriology, in Sumerian and Akkadian philology, and recognized with a scholarship from that Accademia d'Italia for the study of Phoenician grammar in 1936, the same year his first collection of poems was published. These experiences would eventually lead him to a wayward translation of the Hebrew Bible that emphasized the text's body elements and Italian's own Eastern roots. Despite his efforts to stay out of the war, Villa was sent to prison camp in Holland for 4 months and to a military camp in Germany for months in 1944 before escaping. He took part in the resistance with a group of anti-fascist critics and artists in Milan, withstanding injury and searches by the police and hiding under false documents, eventually witnessing at first hand the hanging of Mussolini in Piazzale Loreto. Villa's background in ancient languages and aesthetics led him to a collaboration in the early 1950s with Italian expats in Brazil, collector Pietro Maria Bardi and his wife, the architect Lina Bo Bardi, on path-breaking inaugural exhibitions for the Sao Paulo Museum of Art. These didactic exhibits aimed to forge a newly global art history. They constituted a utopian attempt to reconstruct the violent synthesis of nations and world affected by the wars. These experiences led Villa to reformulate modern philology in a subversive and semi-utopian key. His radical etymological dictionary of Italian set out to trace the relations of his native language to ancient languages outside of Europe, Mesopotamian, Semitic, Paleo-Mediterranean, while including all upstart neo-formations that represent a semantic event as well. The dictionary sought ultimately to expose what he called the myth of Romance languages as an ideological attempt to shore up a purely European identity in the context of a reality that in fact extended eastward and traversed all sectors of the Mediterranean. Grappling with his work requires grappling with phantom instances of polyglottism more discomposing than those of the storied collages of Eliot, Pound, and their post-war followers, in texts in which cultural idioms improperly acquired and deployed are estranged from themselves. His Italian writings are subject to eruptions by geographical and temporal alterity, Milanese and other dialects, variations on ancient Romance and Saxon languages, English, and an Edenic tongue of his own forging. Staging micro-displacements of encrusted, dead, and national languages, Villa's works make palpable the fact that Italianness, like any nationality, is fundamentally a synthesis of migrations. In the wake of fascism, he articulates a more capacious Italia, or Whytalia, as he ludically chose to write it, using 2 Ys. A macaronic Whytalian appears in the poem Tenzone, written in 1948, the year in which Villa moved to Rome. The poem is written in the tradition of the dispute in Provençal poetry in a satirical mongrel style, in stratifications of corrupted Lombard and Roman dialect that face off against one another. Andrea Cortellessa has called it polyvernacular rather than polylingual. My attempt at translation of this, I, da Italy, I, what tough luck, I, what a jinx, mud on misfortunes, as lipa, to be stuck here so empty to tripe, da Italy, he owled, roaring his jaws right quick. And I couldn't really domesticate it because it's pretty discomposing in the original. Having been raised in a humble environment in which Milanese dialect was spoken and attended seminary where Latin was spoken all day long, he developed an intimacy with these languages for reasons both affective and intellectual, in the face of which the mandate to speak standard Italian in school and in public reinforced the measures taken against dialects on the part of the fascist regime, as well as class prejudice. The word Padritalia in Tensone sonically echoes Patria d'Italia, or fatherland of Italy, yet literally renders as father's cutter. I chose to translate it in this instance as da Italy, so it's clearly not a literal translation. A fine metaphor for Villa's operations on a language he regarded as enslaved to the pompous academicism of a nationalist elite. I'll close by sharing Villa's ultimate riposte to the ideologies in which his youth had been saturated, both fascist and rationalist, moving from his initial proposals of an ideal nationality and a pure phonetic ideology. Emilio Villa eventually designed hydrologies, spherical poems filled with water designed to be read while rolling. The subtitle for these forms basically translates as rolling balls and hydrological anti-structures. And the pun works. It's supposed to be there. In the dizzying accompanying text for this work, which was printed in 2 offset colors so as to induce vertigo, Villa proposes that wobbling balls, carnal, vulnerable, undressed violations of pure Euclidean geometry, will roll in dissoluteness. Disorientation, driven by the whip of the unpillageable transverbal against ideological and linguistic convention, destined to debilitate the internal network entangling fraud and bypass its field. Staging micro-displacements of national languages, such works make palpable the fact that any nationality is fundamentally a synthesis of careening bodily migrations. With recourse never complete to the transverbal, they make manifest that any mode of linguistic belonging is also an embodied one, never completely in common, yet graspable for revised communities to come. In the wake of fascism, the post-war authors with whom I've shared most of my time in this project articulate a more capacious riposte to a citizenry, and simultaneously, in seeking perfect disharmony, to quote Amelia Rosselli, they incarnate the punctums of cosmopolitanism and the exclusions that give the lie to the utopian rhetoric of interconnection driving globalization. These multilingual tableaus, imploding in 3 dimensions, oblige us in singular ways to inhabit the muted entanglements and rhetorics of internationalism and universality, and rethink citizenship as it exceeds political definitions. They enable those with the patience to translate them, to track the constantly transmogrifying shape and sound of citizenship, and keep it in motion. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jen, for that turning over the fabric of thinking and research. I'm sure you'll be ready to take some questions now.
Sure, I would welcome them. Thank you for coming, Mark. I know that was a lot, but I was thinking as John was reading his introduction that all the pieces, you'll see how they kind of all come together, and maybe if you've taken some class that is completely unrelated, apparently you'll see how that relates as well. So yeah, so really anything, it doesn't, this is a text that doesn't just circulate around Italy, but I think it's important to look with precision at, you know, this word fascism and this phenomenon of fascism so that we can then, you know, articulate its extension. Léon.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question about a specific moment when you were quoting the counter argument and quoting Perloff about that there would be two phases in this sort of experimentation that Marinetti had, and I wonder if another way to also tie them together is the problem of speed and the emphasis on immediacy that is present from the start in Marinetti. And I was just wanting to ask you if you think that this sense of speed and immediacy is ever reconcilable to like a non-fascist, non-problematic approach to language.
Oh, so immediacy, you're seeing immediacy as having some inherent link to fascism?
I'm asking about this, yes, because you showed an old document that was wonderful. I think it was called The Laying of the Table.
Yes.
And then you also showed an archive about Marinetti and the telegram?
Mm-hmm, yes, the Wireless Imagination Manifesto.
Yeah, this is a sort of dream of immediacy. And I wonder to what extent this is linked with the fascist enterprise.
Well, I love that question. I have been a counter-futurist for all my life since I knew what futurism was for this reason, but I don't necessarily always think of it as being, I think of it as being for lots and lots of reasons, but part of why I had to write about Marinetti is because in a section that I just didn't include here, he forecasts the world of communications that we're living in right now. It's really uncanny. The way that he heralds the disinterest in the past and the need to communicate with all the peoples of the globe, and the way that you can enjoy the voice of Caruso while then switching to Chinese boxing. And he's fascinated by this, and simultaneity would become one of the aspects of the fascist regime that would be the simultaneity of the imperial past and the imperial present, where you force that. So I don't know how qualified I want to make it, but I very much think that the disavowal of the origins of products and things, as you've studied with me in my eco-poetics classes, is part of what makes it possible to just even be in this telecommunicative economy without feeling awful all the time, which I do. So, I mean, I'm circling around it, but I think that the insistence on speed and the ahistoricity that allows us, for instance, what are the Republicans doing now? What are they thinking about Putin? I mean, you could listen to Trump and he would say one thing one day, and it made no difference if he had said the opposite thing the day before, because we're all just hypnotized by the constant barrage of simplified information that demands that we keep up. And this is something that I hate about even the literary world, and many aspects of particularly US culture, but it's not limited to that. So I think, I could talk for a really long time trying to work that out, but I am really interested in your question and what the disavowal of where things come from and what happened yesterday and the constant barrage of new information can do to hold a citizenry in thrall to the latest spectacle. And though I'm not going to articulate all of those parallels in my book, I want them to just kind of stand because they're just really clear. to me, and hopefully there will be to other people as well.
Just to follow up on that question, I wonder if you might link that to Ham's idea of the cantos as a work of, so to speak, self-evidence, so that what is presented is something which actually defies the necessity of interpretation and gives immediate access to a particular version of history which is actually deeply ahistorical.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, he wanted you to know the history that he was going to tell in the, oh my goodness, the Blah of Romance, in that book wherein he reassembles the canon according to his predilections. He wants you to have his version of the history. On the other hand, yeah, that kind of profession is what led to the new criticism. And I do talk about the new criticism and the well-wrought urn and the unleaking text in my discussion of Amelia Rosselli. Just this idea that the text is this world unto itself and that one need not investigate, and I'm, yeah, it is deeply ahistorical, but it at the same time, it wants to impose that history that it wants. So in that way, it's similar to the rewriting of history by any fascist dictator.
Just a legal statement a few days ago, to somebody who recently came in Belgrade, he decided that he needed a Serbian dictionary. So he went to the bookstore where he had previously bought one, and he was offered either a Serbian or a Croatian dictionary. And it turned out they were precisely the same dictionary. And he pointed this out to the person in the bookstore who absolutely refused to accept it. He says, they are totally different, even though they are completely identical.
Yeah, I mean, those things completely fascinate me. And, I've had people working on the same language but different in translation classes, and it's really fascinating. How do you mark the difference between those languages, and what do you do? Yes, there's someone in the second row, and then Victoria.
I was just going to ask, to what degree do you see these sorts of images that are so intrinsic, so strongly tied, like milk, but it becomes so strongly tied to a certain movement and setting, like fascism here? You see them trickle down even outside of that time and place. And if you ever think that those sorts of images or concepts can be reclaimed outside of fascism or the original movement?
For instance, the figure of milk.
Yeah.
I think anything is always reclaimable. Like, think of the pink triangle, or that's partly what artists do. Is artists, not just artists, but artists help it along. In reappropriating what could have been degrading imagery, or imagery that really has the effect of harming people. In the case of Mother's Milk, this is something that just goes through the whole manuscript, because essentially there's still a really strong sense that we all have a mother tongue. And the person that started this manuscript said that she didn't have a mother tongue, and that she was a child of the Second World War because her father was assassinated on Mussolini's order. She was born in Paris. She ended up in exile in 3 countries, finished high school in New York. And so each of the siblings ended up in a different country. She ended up in Italy out of love for her Italian Jewish father, and her siblings ended up in Indiana and London. And, each of them had that available identification, but none of them ever fully belonged. So I find it really fascinating the way that we still even in the good discourse, right? Even the good discourse thinks about like the mother tongue as something that's relatively unquestioned, but it actually leaves a lot of people out. And even in my teaching, I see shame with people with their heritage languages, like, well, I can't really work in that, or I can't translate from that because I don't really know it, by which they mean it's not my language of literary studies. Or, you know, they haven't learned to write it or something, and that's a dynamic that comes out in the book. So in the case of Marinetti, I find it fascinating that he admits that Africa was, you know, giving him the mother's milk, but then he needs to, toward the end of his career, like militarize milk and solidify it. And the whole fascist regime is actually doing this. Can you imagine a whole country like celebrating this milk fabric? It's really surreal, but it's actually like these are the levels to which you have to go in order to actually hold this campaign of autarky, of complete self-sufficiency, which is a dream. I mean, it's a fantasy. It's never going to happen. As we're seeing now, you know, the gas prices are high. Oh, well, like, let's think of all the ways that we depend on this country that supposedly we're so dismissive of. But I think there are many artists that have thought about maternity and milk and, you know, in a completely different way. So I don't think that these are transhistorical fixities at all. Victoria.
Thank you, Gemma. That was great. I have a couple of questions. The first one is about Marinetti, because you talked about Emilio Villa in São Paulo. And Marinetti also went to Brazil a couple of times.
Yes.
In the 1920s, right? And I remember reading about his visits to Brazil, in which he wanted to visit the favelas in Rio de Janeiro. Favelas are like these spaces where low-income population live in, usually irregular forms of housing, precarious housing, and where like most of the population of the favelas tends to be Afro-Brazilians. So apparently he really enjoyed going to the favelas, and there are some notes, you know, some articles by local journalists, like emphasizing on how curious it was that this futurist poet was going to the favela, which of course also reflected the strangeness that the white Brazilians felt with regards to the Afro-Brazilian population that lived in the favelas. So I wanted to ask you if you have come across anything about Marinetti's use of race including a Brazilian context or not.
Right.
And I have a second question. But
Yeah. Will you remember it if I try to answer that one?
Sure.
So this is why I have written 2 book chapters about this completely repulsive figure, because he actually did really exceed the boundaries of the bourgeois literary figure, and you know, in the worst ways, but also in some ways that are pretty interesting. You know, like, wait, he gets that he's not just white, and he's choosing to put that forward. I mean, many people would disavow that. So I think of Audubon, for instance. I just learned that his mother was black, and yet he had this whole fairy tale that he told. That was probably the normal thing to do, right? So I think that the reason for the appropriation of his own childhood, if you can call it that, is strategic. Like, that it gives him this larger than life, you know, sort of power of Africa, and you know, like that he can suckle on everything, he can leech off of everything. So that's why I find it interesting, and also to go to the favela is to like understand that you need the masses, you know, and this is something he had in common with Trump, who Hillary Clinton never came to the Midwest during her campaign. He was going to mining towns, you know, and so they really understood like populism. You know, they were making it. Populism was being created, and in the anatomy of fascism, that's one of the arguments that Paxton makes, is that, you know, mass politics absolutely lays the conditions for the development of fascism. That's not something we generally, I think, in a democratic country, that's not how we think about it. So I have to read those articles, though. I mean,
I can send you some.
Oh, I would love that, because I tried to do research on those trips and the trips to St. Petersburg and Moscow, and they weren't all celebratory. I mean, they were booed.
Yeah, in Rio too.
Yeah, so, you know, but it's fascinating to see him on this campaign. He's kind of like a capitalist artist that's, I mean, I use the word multinational somewhere pointedly because it's kind of like that, a multinational aesthetic and ego campaign. What was your other question?
It was a more general question about this mixing of languages, you know, thinking of Henry James and the Central Park and all these languages, and the fact that the presence of all these languages together is often the result of some form of violence or precariousness in the places of origin of the migrants, right? Many of them did not immigrate because they just wanted to live in the U.S. They were fleeing hunger, misery, sometimes war refugees or some form of violence, right? So how can we understand all the types of violence that led these immigrants to be together in this Tower of Babel in tandem with this multilingual context?
Yeah, you know, that's so important because Henry James, notwithstanding the fact that he knows a few languages and all this, he kind of depicts them as being so happy, and really what it is he's really disarmed because they're comfortable in Central Park, and he's thinking, this is not for you. You know, I mean, and where do you even come from? Why are you not even local color? The way you would have been when I'm strolling through the countryside in Italy, all of a sudden now you're this horrible monster. So, I mean, it's very violent, like how he is seeing the reality of the multi-ethnic metropolis, but that's not everything. There's no empathy, and there's no empathy in the campaigns. I mean, there is some. So, okay, John mentioned that I wrote a whole thing on the Statue of Liberty. So there's Emma Lazarus, who wants to see that as a beacon for immigrants and who's working on behalf of Jewish Russians fleeing pogroms. So there are those people. And then there are these people that are absolutely terrified of what this nation is going to become. Sound familiar? And so, I mean, the political cartoons, you could just go through so many of them, and the assimilative process to which these people are subject is so explicit. So in the Ford English School, run by the Ford factories, the immigrants would, there was a ceremony at the end whereby they were wearing their traditional clothing, and then they go into a giant melting pot, and they come out wearing US dress. And so their graduation as English speakers, as people who have been schooled in the English language, is complete, so that they look like Americans too. And, you know, I mean, we need not say that generations and generations of people were and are put through this still. And I just find it so interesting that even though there are people working translingually and so on, even in the face of so much rhetoric about multiculturalism, there's still so much balking when someone has a different accent, or something is just a little bit different grammatically, and many of these authors are just not really accepted. They're quite marginalized for that reason. I mean, so Amelia Gossembi was the daughter of a hero of the Italian resistance, and when I played her, reading her poetry, various people that I was friends with said, this isn't Italian, I don't know what she is, she's French. Everyone had a different idea about what her problem was, but she wasn't Italian. And actually, her accent is a manifestation of the Italian resistance against fascism within Italy and in Franco's Spain. So that's the kind of dynamic that I'm so fascinated by. But I think, yeah, just kind of accounting for how these multilingual spaces are not happy spaces, and they're not just spaces of enterprise where someone goes to make it big, but they're just surviving.
Perhaps, Jen, given the time, we should move on so that you could maybe talk a little to people over a glass of wine or water if there are further questions. But I'd just like finally to thank you so much for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.